at the end. So yeah, story inspiration call. Run these usually for 60 minutes. Can run longer. Got up to 90 minutes if depending on how much we want to chat. But usually people have had enough of me after an hour. I think on an evolving basis, I think there's kind of two reasons maybe to join these calls. One is to explore stories that you might want to tell about yourself, to communicate who you are, to promote your work, to engage an audience. That was obviously the starting point for my work. I've actually had some people join these calls though who are assembling material for a memoir. That's another perfectly fine use for these calls as well. Format is kind of pretty. I think you guys have probably attended one of these before. I share one or two stories. In today's case, I share one story. I also share a handful of story ideas. So I go through my own story research for the last few weeks, which is mostly me going through recent photos, but also through recent journal entries. So I go through all of the research, I then share a story, I show you how I've structured it on the timeline, what the one idea is, that kind of thing. And I give you a bit of time to think about a story. I'll give you a prompt if you want to follow it. I'll give you a bit of time to think about a story that has come up for you in the last month or ish. It could be further in the past. And then if you're willing, there's no requirement to, but if you're willing, then it's your turn to share it, and I'll give you live feedback on it. Recording policy is that my section is recorded, so if you interject, you will be on the replay. I don't record the group session afterwards, so that's private to everyone who's live on the call. And I don't let any Fathom or note takers or AI bots in. I don't actually know if that will work on Proton, but yeah, no bots, people only. So yeah, processes as I just outlined. So the process I follow is ahead of these calls, I browse through recent photos. If you don't have photos, I've got some clients who just don't take any photos, and that's cool. But you need to be doing some kind of ongoing journaling, I think, in that case, or recording ideas, documenting what's come up. I think it's worth having a bit of fun with this. I think it is actually quite fun to explore the things that you've been doing and allow yourself the time and the luxury to do that, and not think that we're too busy or whatever. I then select stories to tell just based on guts, feel, or whether there's an interesting fact about the story. So again, I'll go through that in a bit. Yeah, and then map it on a timeline and decide on one idea, which is the bridge concept at the end of the story, if you were going to connect it to a sales message or something. So having a look through my photos from the last few weeks, what have I been up to? Well, Chris, you mentioned Norfolk Park. I actually volunteer at Junior Park Run sometimes in Norfolk Park on a Sunday morning. I've spoken quite a bit on these calls, perhaps not to you guys, but I've spoken quite about Park Run quite a lot on recent calls about how the fact it's volunteer led, it creates this kind of community event, and it pulls people together. I basically think that's kind of the kind of thing that we need. So I go and volunteer at Norfolk Park because it's the nearest one. I'm also crafty because my son Hugo is a good runner. He likes to run, but he's not always very keen on going, but he likes it when we're there. So I found that if I go and volunteer, and if I go and marshal partway around, then that's an extra thing that encourages him to want to do it. So I do that, and I go to Duke's afterwards, have a nice breakfast. So yeah, I guess always with these things, I'm trying to ask, like, well, what's the interesting fact about it? So, well, the interesting fact is I'm being a bit crafty by trying to encourage him to run, really. I share a lot of running stories on these calls, and obviously for big runs, you get a medal afterwards. And recently, all of my running medals strangely went missing. I was like, oh, that's weird. I wonder where they've gone. And I was in the kitchen the other day washing up, and Hugo clanked in wearing all of my medals, a hat that he's stolen, and holding a bunch of football cards. So I filed this photo away for when he's 18 or maybe a bit older. But yeah, just I guess you're always trying to ask like, well, what's the interesting fact? It's like, well, pay attention to things or look after things. I guess could be the kind of one idea or bridge concept from that. I've also been watching a lot of sport with him. So a few weeks ago, I took him back. So I support a football team called Tranmere Rovers, which is where I grew up. I didn't grow up in Sheffield. I grew up on the Wirral. We had a big game, the last game of the season. We were in a relegation battle. We may have needed to win to have stayed up. So it was a big game. I think we had about twice the number of fans there. And I managed to convince Hugo. He wasn't very keen on going because he thinks he's a Sheffield United fan. So I had to convince him to come. But we did eventually make it to the game. And the first half was terrible. It looked like we were going to get relegated. It looked like we were going to lose and get relegated. But then we did look like a football team for 10 minutes in the second half. We did score, which was a nice moment. I actually picked Hugo up so he could see what was going on. And I just felt like a nice thing. There was a big pitch invasion at the end. So by the end, Hugo was fuming that we didn't also go on the pitch and set off smoke bombs and everything else that was going on. So we've been watching sport, but it's not just about the sport. It's like for me, it's about doing it with him. I think at this point. I also journal about this. So obviously, exploring your photos is one way of going through what you've been up to recently. I think also just exploring journal entries. So I maintain a. I've got it here actually. I just have an A5 day a page journal. I know people do like morning pages and morning journaling and stuff. I actually write at the end of the day about what I've done that day. That's just my kind of approach to it. And what I do is when I look back, if there's something happened that day that I think is potentially useful as a story idea, I just dog ear the corner of the page. That's my kind of referencing and filing system. Um, I think you need like some kind of low tech. Obviously, the thing about journaling is that without that kind of referencing or notation, you kind of lose track of what entries are actually worth going back to. But this was my journal entry from that day. And again, like looking back on this, there's actually more detail in the story that if I was retelling it, I could layer in. So actually, we travelled over to the Wirral at 8 a.m. on Saturday morning, and the kids on the drive over. Sometimes the kids are good in the car, and sometimes they absolutely peck my head. Like they were just nagging, they were just screeching at each other, winding me up. I actually had to. I was driving on the A6 somewhere near High Peak, which is near Stockport, and I checked that there was no cars behind me. I slammed the brakes on. I turned around, gave them a proper bollocking. I said, "Look, we're not stopping at the garden centre for a snack. If you two don't pack it in." And then after that, Hugo said I was the worst daddy. He said I was stupid. Uh, so I made him. I said to him, "Look, we're only going to stop because they wanted to stop at the garden centre because there's a ride-on train at the garden centre. So we're only going to stop if you apologise for saying what you said." And he apologised to me about 6 seconds before we passed the garden centre. So there's a lot more detail. There's always more detail in the story once you kind of dig in. And actually, I didn't note down all of this in the journal entry, but it's come back to me now from seeing this and from me making a note that actually the kids were winding me up no end in the car journey. It's kind of just jogs your memory of like, well, what are all the specifics that you might want to layer into the story to make it more engaging? After Tranmere, the next day we went and watched a Sheffield Eagles play rugby league. So they it just so happened that Eagles were playing in Widnes that weekend, which is not very far from where my parents are. So I roped in my dad as a notional Widnes fan, and we went and watched Eagles play in Widnes. We went to the worst pub I've been to in a very long time. Had some crisps. Uh, got a photo of. So this is my dad and Hugo watching an Eagles player line up a conversion. And again, it just felt like I've spent a lot of time watching sports over the years, but it just feels like these things are like nice trips that we're doing together at the moment. Back onto the running stories. The last run I did was the Leeds Half Marathon a few weeks ago. I went and stayed with my mate who lives pretty close to Headingley, which is where the run started. We went out for we nipped out for milk the night before and ended up going to a pub and had a non-alcoholic beer. But I found a road called Drummond Road. So I had to take a photo of that. Again, I feel like this is the kind of thing that must be useful for some kind of social post or some kind of image at some point. I went for one thing and then I found this. So I got a photo of Drummond Road. On the morning of the run, I was busy not being at the start line. The finish was actually on the rugby pitch at Headingley. So obviously, as you tell these stories, like there are themes that come over. So obviously, watching sport and watching rugby is one theme for me. And again, we have to be asking, what's the interesting fact about the story? Well, the interesting fact about the story is that I nearly missed the start of the run because I misread or misunderstood the start times. I thought I was in a much later wave than I actually was, and I was busy. I was poking my head around the rugby ground. I was having a look at the cricket pitch, not being at the start line, but I did make it in the end because I'm crazy about being early, but I could very easily have missed the start. I did get a photo. My mate's wife actually took this, so that's my mate Dan, who lives in Leeds. I stayed with him the night before. Got a high five off Dan and his kids on the run. Survived the run. Managed the signature Rob Drummond sprint finish. But I think maybe I'm less fast than I think I am because apparently I finished at exactly the same time as a guy dressed in a SpongeBob SquarePants fancy dress outfit. So there we go. But I think for me the interesting fact about the Leeds run was getting there in the start and how busy it was, and about how I nearly completely missed my wave because I wasn't really paying attention. I thought I was in the yellow wave. If you have a look at my run number, it's got blue in the middle and yellow around the edge. I thought I was in the yellow wave, I was not. I was in the blue wave. Okay, so that's a sort of snapshot of like things that I've considered telling stories about that I could maybe lean on, but I'm going to tell you a story about something called Robert's Garage. So when I was about 4 or 5, I used to like small toy cars, a bit like I imagine any 4 or 5 year olds. I used to like cars. I used to kind of drum them around in my room. And ahead of my birthday, my dad's always been very practical and very hands on and makes things. And I knew he was making something for me in the garage. And he told me that. He said, look, it's not a secret. I'm making you something for your birthday. And I used to go into the garage with my cars, and he'd be there, and like the garage seemed massive. It's only a small room, but he had this big workbench along one side, and he was building me a toy garage. And I remember going up and standing on the bench by him and asking if I could play with it yet. And he said, no, you can't play with it yet. You have to wait a bit. And then I went in one morning, and he said, okay, like, don't push your car on this bit because you'll get stuck in the paint because the paint's still tacky. But you can run the cars down the slide. So there was a big slide linking what he'd built as the top car park down to the bottom car park. So I remember going in when I was 4, being very excited, running these cars down this slide and watching them appear at the bottom. After my birthday, I then used to obviously have this garage in my room, then my friends round would play with it. And then all of a sudden, at some point, it vanished from my life and I forgot about it. And it's fallen out of my head for 30 years. Until a few weeks ago, I was in the loft of my parents' house. And it's amazing the amount of crap that's in my loft. It's like they never throw anything away. And I was rooting around in the loft for something else. And I lifted up a box, and there's this garage. There's Robert's Garage. I'm like, oh, I remember that. And I was there by myself that weekend. I didn't have the kids with me. And I just thought, oh man, like my son Hugo loves toy cars like more than I ever did. Like he's got all of these Hot Wheels and he gets them doing different things. And I was like, oh, damn. Like, I reckon Hugo would have loved this. And I kind of think, I kind of had this moment of like, I think I missed the trick here. There's no point in this gathering dust in my dad's loft. Like this should have been passed on. Anyway, a few weeks later, we made another trip for the Tranmere game that I mentioned for the rugby and the Tranmere game. And my dad's got all of these like Hornby electric trains in the loft. So the kids go up sometimes and play trains. So I went up there while the kids were playing trains, and I pulled out the garage and I put it on the floor by Hugo. And he goes, "Wow, what's that?" All of a sudden, all of the trains are forgotten. He's now playing cars. He's got all of his cars. He's lining up his cars on the garage. And I'm like, "Okay, if you like it, it's yours, mate." So we clean it up, we pull it down, we bring it back to Sheffield. It's now in his room upstairs, and he immediately starts playing with it. He gets all of his cars on it. So you can see here that this was just after we got back from the trip. This was the first thing he did. And that night when he went to bed, we usually read a story, and we'll read, I don't know, The Gruffalo or something. But he didn't want to read a story that night. He wanted to make up a story using the garage as a set, and we had to pick a car that was our car, and we had to pretend that our car was a goodie or was a baddie or was trying to rob the garage or was trying to save the garage. So all of a sudden, I've gone from feeling that I missed the boat to feeling like I passed on a memory and passed on a family heirloom in some regards. So that was a story I wanted to share with you. In the telling of this, and actually as I've been talking through it, I call this a vertical timeline. This is just a list of all the points that have happened in the story. So each line being a different beat of the story. I've actually got this open in front of me just so I'm not winging it. Obviously, depending on how you're telling a story, if you're telling the story in a group or at an event or something, then you'd have to kind of memorize the points, I guess. But for most of my storytelling, it's either written or I'm talking through a story on a podcast episode. So I can pretty much have the notes in front of me and keep it on track. So I'm always trying to get to the horizontal timeline, which is this, which I think you guys should be familiar with, where it's the chronological series of events that makes up the story. When we start with the context on the left and end up with the one idea on the right. But actually, to get to this, what I do is I first create this kind of vertical list, because sometimes, obviously, if you're just creating the timeline, you kind of need to know what's going to go on the timeline first. So I create the vertical timeline first, almost as a list of like, well, it's almost an assembly of what are all of the beats of the story that might need to go on. So I've got where I was 4, I like cars. You know, my dad used to make things in the garage. I talked about his workbench and how big the garage seemed. So this was like the context at the start. We then got almost, I put this as suspense. It's not really suspense. It's more kind of intrigue of like, I've gone in with my cars. I wanted to play with it. He was telling me, look, don't brum your cars on these bits because the paint's still tacky. They'll get stuck. We then got a few ups in the story of, you know, I'm there in the garage. I'm running cars down the slides. I'm playing with it in my room. I then forget about it for years and years and years. I then find it in the loft. There's actually some dialogue in here that because my dad was up there in the loft with me, and I actually said to him like, "What the hell have you still got this?" It's like, "You've got so much crop up here, Dad." So if I was writing this is an opportunity to kind of insert some dialogue into the story of like me almost berating my dad for like hoarding old stuff. But then I was quite conscious of like trying to get some. So the X is internal conflict. Well, it's the X is conflict, but in this case, the conflict was internal. Of me thinking, shit, I think Hugo would have loved this. I think I missed a trick. So I tried to slow down the telling at that point and focus on the kind of internal dialogue I was having with myself of like, damn, I should have done something with this. We then jump ahead a few weeks. So the kids are in the loft playing trains. I go digging. I find this thing. and Hugo immediately starts playing with it. All of the trains are forgotten, and we then have the story set at the end. I think there's a few. I think there's a few potential one ideas from this. I went with in the telling. I went with memories, but actually, it could also be about things and artifacts, and how people see how people maybe see value in your things and artifacts that you're not expecting. It could also be about fit, because actually, I wonder actually, on reflection, if my dad actually, without knowing it, my dad actually made this for my son, and I was just a custodian in the middle, because Hugo loves the garage more than I ever did. So I think that's maybe a nice connection. I was just keeping it warm for 30 years. It's also maybe about timeless toys. If you think about all of the toys and all of the screens and all of the gadgets that my kids have got, it's really nice when they just play with old toys, or when they want to throw balls around the garden, or when they want to wrestle, or when they just want to do things that kids have always been doing and always will do. So it just felt like a time. It didn't matter that 30. It didn't matter. It's 30, 40 years old now. Like, it didn't matter. So yeah, that's the timeline that I came up with, and that's again, sometimes this timeline is pretty close to the vertical timeline, but sometimes I'll use this as a drafting exercise, and then the final horizontal timeline sometimes can look a bit different. So just as a story prompt and something to think about, what item would you retrieve from your childhood if you could? And maybe who would you give it to? That's just something to think on over the next few minutes. Any reactions to that story, by the way? I know you had to drop off for a minute, David.
No, it was the internet. Just wasn't. I was still here. I was still listening. Just the internet wasn't good enough for the video. Yeah, I was thinking what you said about the kind of imaginative play, and just interacting with something that is timeless, and yeah, just the imaginative play. I see it in my own son, and it's the most enjoyable to watch, and it's the most when he spends time on his own as well. There's a lot of toys we have that he needs to play with me, but when he gets into those little moments of imaginative play with maybe just a few simple objects. Right now it's a sand pit outside with some cars and diggers and trucks and stuff. So
there we go.
Yeah.
I think as well, sometimes you tell a story and then you reflect on it again afterwards. And I think actually reflecting on it now, there's also the workmanship that went into the creation of the garage. Like, my dad spent, I don't know how long he spent on it, but he spent a lot of time on it. So there's almost like a craft element that's gone into it as well. I kind of think that's like the opposite of AI and the push a button and AI will just generate whatever you want it to generate. It'll make your website. This was the opposite of that. This was my dad having this idea. The garage was actually modelled on a garage opposite where his mum and my nan used to live. It was modelled on a real garage. But then, yeah, he spent however long weeks in the garage kind of making it. So maybe there's a sort of built to last element as well.
Yes, I think there's it sort of resonated for me in a slightly different way. One of the difficulties I have very often is convincing people that they need or that stories from their childhood can be relevant to their business now. And this actually mirrors that, in the sense that you perhaps had the memory of the garage, but was buried because you didn't think about the garage for 30 years.
Yeah.
Or if you did, you just assumed it had gone and you just remembered playing with it. And
out of sight, out of mind it was, yeah.
Yeah. And and I think a lot of childhood stories are like that. It needs something to trigger them. But then, when you found it, the memories came back. But then the question became, how do I apply this? How do I make use of this? And obviously, Hugo was the first thought there, but would it work? And actually, the answer to that was yes, it did work, and it was brilliant. And so a story from childhood might it needs that sort of trigger of inspiration, that turning point in your story to for it to become relevant in the present and to a present business.
Yeah.
So it might be a useful way of helping people understand the value of childhood experiences.
Yeah. I always get people to talk about early childhood experiences, and when I'm working with a business owner on their story, like they want to leap ahead to the genesis of business type stories. But I think the reality is that the patterns of behavior and the patterns of who we are have begun way earlier than that.
Yeah.
And this isn't really I guess it does tie into my kind of making memories, preserving memories, passing on experiences. So often there is a connection, if you kind of think about it. I'm going to give you a few. Yeah, we're on 12:30. I'm going to give you about 5 minutes, guys, just thinking about the process that I've gone through here. Obviously, I've gone through different photos of things I've been up to, journal entries, just thinking about things that you've been doing. If you do want to pick out a story, and then potentially what I get people to do initially is map it out, and this kind of what are all of the beats of the story. If you're gonna share it, what might go into the story, and then what's in one idea. If you need more than 5 minutes, there's no problem. But yeah, I'm gonna pause the recording, and yeah, I'll give you to sort of 36, 37 minutes past, and we'll just see how we're going.
Sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yeah, so I'm gonna pause the replay. Going to give you 5-6 minutes. The task is to think through recent events, recent possible story ideas that you've been going on, or to have a think about the prompts that I've just given you, of like what item would you retrieve from your childhood and maybe pass on to something else. What is that item? What is the story around that item? That's another angle. And then just think about if you were to quickly kind of think about how you tell that story, what elements, what beats of the story might you put on the timeline? Because then we can kind of have a quick talk through it, if that makes sense.